Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute as people trickle in, but thanks for joining us today. We'll start in just a moment. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in just a moment as we have people still getting in the room, but welcome. Great. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our Grow Native webinar, Lessons Learned at Primrose Prairie with Cydney Ross, the Outdoor Education Manager at Deep Roots KC. My name is Lily Germeroth. I'm a Conservation Program Associate with the Missouri Prairie Foundation and its Grow Native program. And thanks for joining us for this next webinar in our 2025 series. Today we'll hear about the challenges and successes of Primrose Prairie throughout its 4 years of care. But before we continue, I'll just review a couple of Zoom basics. When you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section of your screen, which you'll find at the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. I'll read them aloud following the presentation. Thanks in advance for your thoughtful live submissions. Access to this recording and other related information will be sent to all who registered in a follow-up email. So now I'd like to more thoroughly introduce Cydney Ross. Cydney joined Deep Roots in March 2023 as the Outdoor Education Manager. She teaches folks to garden with nature, leads naturalist walks, and hosts the semi-monthly Deep Roots Nature Show. In her role, she collaborates with organizations like the Missouri Department of Conservation and the Johnson County Parks and Recreation District to further their missions to connect communities to nature. Cydney has always had a naturalist spirit, and her earliest memories hiking, paddling Missouri rivers, camping with her families and with her family, and gardening with her mom. She earned a BFA in ceramics from Kansas City Art Institute in 2013 and maintains a fine arts practice with inks made from plants and soil. Her endless curiosity, stewardship for the earth, and background in the arts encourages her to inspire folks to connect with nature. She proudly leads LGBTQ+ inclusive nature programs throughout the Kansas City area and is a self-proclaimed native plant nerd. Thank you for joining us today, Cydney, and we're ready to learn. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lily, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining me for today's program on Lessons Learned at Primrose Prairie. So, as Lily mentioned, I'm Cydney Ross, Outdoor Education Manager for Deep Roots, and my interest in native plants spans about 10 years in practice. But as Lily mentioned, my background is actually in fine arts, but I have found that having a creative background has aided me in creative problem solving, and I like to tell folks that I now sculpt with plants. So prior to working for Deep Roots, who is a nonprofit organization based in Kansas City that advocates for native landscapes, small and large, I was the native landscape specialist at the Anita B. Gorman Conservation Discovery Center in Kansas City. I began my journey there in 2020 during the height of the pandemic because I knew what you plant matters, and I wanted to make sure I was spending as much time outdoors and inspiring others to do the same. So today's garden that we're going to be focusing on is Primrose Prairie, which I like to refer to as my baby. It is the first public garden I designed, installed, and maintain currently at the Discovery Center. So I have several goals for today's program, but specifically I want you all to learn from my successes and failures in the gardens at the Discovery Center. Some of the areas we'll be covering include planning, prepping, installing, and maintenance. So just to kind of categorize this for everybody, we'll start with site observations, gardening goals, talking about designs as a roadmap, as well as the importance of preparing your site before gardening, all the way up to hardscaping, planting, considering planting in phases, and maintenance, both short and long term. So initially, in 2020, I was given the task of turning this area, which was a very informal prairie strip at the Discovery Center, into a more formal or semi-formal garden. And the very first thing I did was observe my location. I wanted to see what plants were already growing here because a lot of times, if you pay attention to what's already growing in an area before you transform it into a garden or apply more plants into that area, you can see maybe what the site conditions would be for specific plants. So in this particular strip, there was a lot of wingstem crownbeard, also giant ragweed, as well as some other species like a hackberry nearby and passion vine. And so I was thinking, okay, so there's already these very prolific native plants growing here. And note, I don't necessarily call our native plants aggressive, even if they can be quite prolific, just because they have their place in this world. And I think language is a very important and nuanced thing. So you'll hear me talking more about that as we go through this presentation. But the first thing that I knew is, okay, with something like wingstem crownbeard or even passion flower, these are going to be, it's going to be more of a full sun condition situation. So 6 or plus more hours of sun. But the other thing I noticed is that hackberry that was looming over the garden. And so I knew full sun species could thrive here, but as the garden progresses, you'll see kind of the impact of having some shade in the late afternoon. And so again, that is a hackberry, Celtis occidentalis. There's a couple of them right there hanging over. And when I was looking at this garden in the winter of 2020, something that can catch people off guard is the canopy layer, right? And so in the wintertime, there's no canopy. So it feels like there's a lot more sun that comes down than there actually is. And that is a mistake I've made in prior gardens before this one, specifically at my own house, where I thought, okay, I've got all this sun, I can plant prairie species, but it turned out to be a more shaded condition. Now, thankfully, with this particular area, again, it does get at least 6 hours of sun before that shade approaches in the summertime, which has been helpful. So again, observing your site can give you clues to what may work there. So because I saw lots of prairie species coming up, I had an inkling that perhaps prairie, savanna, and glade species could do well here. Also, look at that cute insect on there. I'm not sure what that is. Probably some kind of wasp, but very cute. Okay, so like with any garden, I like to think not only about the site and determining what plants will work there, but also what your gardening goals are. So for me, if you've ever tuned into my webinars on deep roots, you'll know I'm a huge nerd. I love moths especially. So here on the left, you can see a white-lined sphinx moth, and on the right, a wavy-lined emerald moth, which the latter, as a caterpillar, is a looper caterpillar that takes little petals and things and sticks them to their back as they're munching along. So very cute. So I knew I wanted to garden not only in a semi-formal way, because it was quite tall and woolly prior to me taking over this area. And I knew I wanted to have prairie, glade, savanna type species given the site conditions. And I knew I wanted to support our native Lepidoptera, specifically moths. But of course, this garden has ended up supporting all types of wildlife and is beautiful throughout the year. So not just in the spring or midsummer when it's at its peak, but also things of interest in the fall and through winter. So on my gardening journeys, I always like to get inspiration from our natural communities. I think it's a great way to help you determine site conditions that may be similar in your own property, but also plant combinations. And that's not to say that these cultivated garden spaces are the same as old growth natural areas, but it's a great way to take cues from Mother Nature, who does it best, right? So here on the left, you'll see a Dolomite Glade at Shaw Nature Reserve. This photo is by Jim Rathert, and I loved the combination of Missouri Evening Primrose, Glade Coneflower, and some grasses throughout. And it was a very rocky uh, location, which was not quite similar to the area at the Discovery Center, but we knew we would be amending some of the soil to give it those conditions. And part of that is due to the goals of the Discovery Center here in Kansas City. If you haven't been to the Nature Center here, the Discovery Center, it sits on 9 acres and it features different habitat types found across the state of Missouri, including glades, right? So that is where my inspiration came from. And I also knew I wanted to have seasonal interest throughout the year, but a great way to do that or extend bloom time, like let's say you have a quality of a plant that you really like, in this case, coneflowers or echinacea, consider planting multiple species in that genus. So we've got glade coneflower, pale purple coneflower, and yellow coneflower. They all bloom kind of within that early summer season, but at different times. So you get extended bloom across the season. And that's a trick I learned from Merv Wallace at Missouri Wildflower Nursery. And we did this similarly with our liatris species. So you'll see a little later all the species included in this garden that I created. It includes 3 types of echinacea, 3 types of liatris, and many others. But just as a gardening tip for you all at home, if you like a quality of a plant, and there's several species in that genus, consider planting more of those so that you get that throughout the year. Okay, so in planning, I want to talk a little bit about designs, concepts, and how they can help you on your gardening journey as a roadmap, right? So this was one of the initial concept sketches that I drew well before I started going to the nurseries to select plants. So this was winter 2020. I'm sketching, I'm thinking, okay, I want some really beautiful rocks to give it that kind of glade effect. And I want plants of differing heights and interests throughout the year. And some ways that you can do that in your own locations is by doing overlay drawings. Okay, and just real quick, I know some of you in the audience are thinking, but Sid, I'm not an artist. Hey, you don't have to be an artist to scribble some colors on a piece of paper. Trust me. Drawing is a skill you develop, but this is just to help you kind of make sense of what the plants are going to look like in an area over the course of multiple seasons. So this is an example that I did also for the Discovery Center last year with the bioswales, which we ended up replanting a couple of those areas. So anyway, I think this is a great helpful tip for folks who are trying to visualize. So for me as an artist, it's hard for me to read a textbook, right? But it is easier for me to visualize in this way. So I hope you find this helpful in your own gardening journey. So once I kind of had the concept sketch written out, I then on the right, this is my first initial draft drawing of the site location. And I used a couple stationary moments to help me identify the length and width of the garden, including an already existing rock, the hackberries, and distance from the sidewalk there. And then on the left, you see this crazy design I made of this garden, which includes so many species. And so just for a moment, I would like to suggest for folks who are just getting started in a garden, that is so many species. And especially in a public garden where other people need to take care of it, it's too many. But for me, since I still have involvement in this garden and the landscape at the Discovery Center, I went big, okay? So for those who are just starting out, always remember you can plant in phases. You can start with like 3 to 5 species and always expand and add more plants later. So just some tips. But here you can see some of the species that are included in this planting here. And so something else I'd like to mention about designs in general is that I think it's important to use it as a roadmap, not a hard and fast rule, right? So using a design, whether one that you make or hire out, it gives you a sense of species, the distance and spatial relation between species, so it can aid you in like how many plants you would need for an area. But it doesn't have to look as detailed or specific as the one you see on the left. So I used Adobe Illustrator to create that design. I had a grid laid out and had everything equate to about an inch, or one little square equated to 1 square foot. So that's how I approached it. But there's so many different ways to approach landscape design. This is just what worked for me. So again, using multiple visual aids to kind of process what this garden would look like in its initial stages. So once you've done your planning, and again, I can't stress enough planning, it will set you up for success in the long run, as will site preparation. So there are so many ways to get your site ready for planting. Many years ago, I would try just like digging a hole in my lawn to plant a plant. And unfortunately, it would always get outcompeted by the turf or white clover or whatever was growing in my yard. So at the Discovery Center, because it was with the Missouri Department of Conservation, they went hard, right? They went big. We cut down the existing vegetation from that strip, and then they took a bobcat and scraped away part of the soil. Now, I know that's not great because it's got pros and cons, right? It removes any important mycorrhizae and microbial relations that are already in the soil. It creates disturbance, which can kick up seeds that you don't intend to have in that garden. But the reason they did this is because that seed bank was so full of very prolific native plants. Again, like the wingstem crownbeard, tall ragweed, passion flower, and many other plants. So they wanted to give us a nice a blank slate, if you will. So now, if you're doing this in your own garden, you might consider some other options like solarizing with plastic sheeting during the summertime to kill off some of that vegetation. Though I will note, this practice can also damage the microbial and mycorrhizae layers. So if you are going to solarize, make sure if you're pinning it down for a couple weeks, also remove it to give it time to bounce back so it doesn't totally fry all the good stuff happening in your soil. So that's just one way to do it. Another way would be sheet mulching or lasagna composting. And again, it's using flattened layers of cardboard beneath compost and mulch to help create kind of a weed barrier. That way you have less competition for the new plants that you're installing in a space. So again, there's many ways to do it. One method that I particularly like now is one that I learned from Benjamin Vaught, where he does a light spray of glyphosate to kill the existing turf. But he doesn't remove the turf. He just lets it rest there, and then he plants into that turf. And eventually, and then I think he puts mulch on top of it. And eventually, that grass that was killed decomposes back into organic matter. So again, many ways to approach this. But at the Discovery Center, we went big and we went ahead and scraped that area to give us a blank slate. We then, after that, added about 6 inches of compost, which they then compressed with a bobcat. That was just the approach that the landscape crew at the time liked to implement in that space. So, okay, so once you have planned and once you have prepped your area, it's now time to do some installation. So I got to go rock shopping. I love thinking about hardscaping in a landscape for a lot of reasons, not just to have some structure in the winter seasons or beyond the growing seasons, but also to have moments to anchor your eyes, even in the growing season, and create borders for your gardens. And the reason I like to have a clear, distinguished border is usually because, at least with this garden, it is right in between both a mulch walking path and lawn. And so I wanted to show the intentionality of this garden to show folks, hey, there's a lot of love happening in this space. And so we started off by selecting rocks. These came from Sturgis, which is in KCK here in the KC Metro. It's an awesome place to visit because you can just drive around and look at cool rocks. And both of these types, sandstone you see on the left, I think they call them moss boulders, which is very cute. And then the dolomite, limestone on the right, which is just like such a stunning piece. It's very sculptural, and a nice addition to that area. So here you can see where we placed that large dolomite stone, as well as installed a border of those smaller sandstone rocks. Again, not only to anchor the garden, create interesting views that can last throughout the entire year, but also have a nice delineation between the path and the garden bed. Because clearly we were not going to leave that yellow rope up throughout the entire year. And again, having kind of these defined edges can also be something that I like to call cues for care with a C-U-E-S. That shows intentionality. So especially if you were in a neighborhood that is mostly surrounded by lawns, right? Green turf lawns, having these different borders can help show, hey, there's intention happening here. We're purposefully removing our lawn to create these beautiful gardens that support all types of life. Additionally, you can also plant into some of these rocks. Like, for example, here, this is actually a really great lesson I learned. That rock is perfect to sit on. So maybe it's a little cruel of me, but I went ahead and planted our native prickly pear and succulent species there because, again, it also gives some nice visual interest, but discourages people from walking into the garden to sit on this rock. If you've been to the Discovery Center, you know we have lots of kids and families and people walking around. So again, to kind of show and encourage certain behavior in the garden was why I went ahead and planted that there. And it's just very cute. So that was also another valid reason. So again, to reiterate with hardscaping, it's not just about those aspects I talked about, but it can also be a really great tool for getting into your garden to do weeding. So that big flat rock on the right, I'm often perched on it, pulling out things that aren't supposed to be in the garden. So it allows you to step into your garden without crushing your beloved plants. So something to consider there. So once we had the rocks installed, we also included a layer of plastic over top because we still had a really large swath of that crown beard and other plants in the 9 acres of landscape. And as plants do, the seed can float on the wind or be dispersed by birds. So we went ahead and made sure that to prevent more seeds from coming into this freshly laid compost, which is like ripe for seeds to plant themselves, we took this extra precaution and installed a thick black plastic that we stapled down. And then fast forward to the following spring, we removed the plastic as best we could, and we're ready to start planting. So with installation, it's really important to, of course, be able to source your plants. Here in the Kansas City area, we are so lucky to have local native plant nurseries like So Wild and City Roots Nursery. And we also sourced from our friends across the region like Missouri Wildflower Nursery. So I was able to procure plants in phases for this garden. And again, it's about 50 feet long and at its widest point, 15 feet. And at its shortest point or narrowest point, it's about 5 feet. So kind of a long, narrow garden bed. So we utilized both using a shovel or hand trowel, as well as this bulb tool, which is the name is escaping me right now. It'll come to me later, but it's a really great tool to use with a drill. Now, I will say you want to make sure you have a drill that has one of those handles that you can hold on to. Otherwise, you can really wrench your arm out of place by using it. But with how many plugs we were installing in that garden, and considering at the time there were only 2 of us maintaining the entire 9 acres, we had a lot of work to do. So we got in there with that auger bit. There we go. To get that in there. So I think they're also called like bulb drill heads and things like that. So you can find those at your local nurseries. I think even large box store hardware stores carry them as well. Okay, so now I want to play a game with you guys. This is what the garden looked like once it was initially or through its second growing season. But I'm curious, Do you know how many plants we installed in this planting? Let me know in the chat because I'm curious if you all have an inkling of what that might look like. Someone said 78, and thank you, Jack, for saying auger. That was the word I was looking for. Sally says 1,300. I see 250, 1,500, 200. All really good guesses and lots of variety. So we ended up using about 500 plants in this garden bed. And that was very intentional. We packed them in tight. I think we planted them on between 6 and 12-inch centers. So, meaning they were about that far apart from each plant. And that was strategic because we wanted to lessen the amount of space that competing plants coming into the garden could potentially take up that room. And so we did 500 plants. We started in planting in May of 21 and went through and planted again in June. And I think I even added some plants later that September or October because, our falls are getting warmer, people, and which sucks, but it also does expand our growing season a little bit. So I guess anything's possible. But yeah, 500 plants installed in this space over the course of one growing season. So yeah, planting in phases, right? So this is what it looked like initially in the summer 21. We got some blooms almost immediately. So this was probably in late June, and we had planted that first couple round of specimens in early May, probably late April too, now that I'm thinking about it. And compare that to how it looked like later in the summer of 21. Things are starting to fill out. You can see we mulched over the compost after we planted. And I do think that's a great rule of thumb to do that because again, you want to give your newly installed plants a chance to get established, right? You don't want them to immediately get out competed by weeds. It's also really hard to keep up on weeds that are growing in a freshly laid down area, especially with compost. It's like pretty ripe for them to come through. So now I wanted to dive into a bit of maintenance because as you all know, there's no such thing as a no maintenance garden, okay? All gardens are cultivated spaces, right? So they are determined by our goals. They're determined by the plants we install there. And all of that impacts the way we need to maintain them. So this garden does still require maintenance even to this day, especially this time of year. So I want to talk about the maintenance aspect of this garden for the first few years. Now, of course, seasonal weeding. We have a couple times a year that I find the gardens are especially lush with vegetation. That's going to be early spring, like in April, and this time of year, July, going into August, when we're getting lots of rain and temperatures are warming up. So we would be out there pulling weeds on occasion. Again, because it was its first, or rather, I guess this is its second growing season, there's still other plants that are popping up, but mostly it's just what we installed in that garden. Now, I will say on this end here by the really cute bamboo hoops, which by the way, you can get those at Gardener's Edge online. They sell them in packs and different sizes. Look how cute that is. But here along this edge, which would be on the west side of this garden, up against that taller, woollier section of garden, it had a lot of plants coming in. And you can kind of see them there at the bottom. Not just those taller species I mentioned earlier, but also lots of sedges and some grasses as well. So that second growing season, it was kind of going through, I think I would probably go through about monthly to see what's popping up, pull anything that shouldn't be there. But something I should mention too, in that initial planting, we did water everything right after we planted it for about the first couple weeks. But if I remember correctly, we had a very rainy June that year, so it was very minimal watering on our part. But thereafter, we don't water that garden. Now, the only exception would be is if we really are in like a severe drought and things are starting to look pretty rough. But last year, we didn't water that garden at all. It's just doing its thing as native plants do. So fast forward into its third growing, or rather its second growing season. This is what the garden looked like at peak bloom. So that's probably early June, mid-June, when you have the Missouri evening primrose blooming, you have butterfly milkweed, you've got all the cone flowers. You can see the three cone flowers there, glade, pale, and yellow. You'll also notice there's some rigid goldenrod back there in the middle towards that second rock, which we will talk about more in depth as one of the challenges of this garden. But things are looking pretty good. So planting everything pretty densely and having um, plants with similar sociabilities, like those that are pretty gregarious, paired together, and while pulling those that are more demure, like the rock pink or even the butterfly milkweed, which I find can get out competed pretty easily in a cultivated garden setting. I wanted to make sure there was a little bit of space from those more prolific species over there along the edge. And in that growing season, I was already seeing nature taking place there. Like something that I love to talk about, particularly in regard to the Discovery Center, is that there is nothing natural about that place, right? And that's not to be mean or derogatory, but what I mean is before all the native landscape was installed, it was turf and concrete, right? And maybe some trees, but there wasn't a whole lot in terms of ecological services happening. So you can see how the impact of planting native and understanding what you plant matters in a landscape. It brought turtles. Turtles were already there in the landscape prior to my garden coming in, but you were seeing them come in and laying eggs in that garden, which was very cool to see. And of course, the moth I was hoping to attract, the white-lined sphinx moth, you can see one of their caterpillars there on the left, which just a funny sidebar. I was in that garden weeding that year and saw this caterpillar at the same time as a robin and had to run and get the caterpillar before the robin. Usually, I would let the robins have those delicious creatures, not only for themselves, but for their babies, which we all know baby birds need soft-bodied insects to survive. But I really wanted to see this caterpillar up close and appreciate it because this was one of my big goals for planting this garden was to support wildlife. So kind of fun thing to see and just feels like very rewarding when you put all that effort into building a garden. So last year, 2024, some things I noticed is that our coneflower species, which evidently are shorter lived perennials, right? They don't live as long as some of our other species. They will end up dying out, which is probably why they produce so much seed so that they can replant themselves as those older plants fade out. But I was starting to notice that. And I was also starting to notice that the rigid goldenrod I put in there was such a big mistake. I should have listened to my buddy Matt Bunch of Casey Community Gardens. He's like, Sid, rigid goldenrod is a beautiful plant, but for a footprint that small, it's going to get huge. And not only did it get huge, it also got powdery mildew pretty severely. So the first couple years, I tried to maintain the height within that garden by performing something called the Chelsea chop. So this is a method of cutting back your plant about 1/3 to half the size to give it a more shrubbier appearance with more blooms. You can do this with a lot of different species, particularly those in the Asteraceae family. They take to it quite well, but you got to make sure you do this between end of May to about beginning or mid-June. I like to say Memorial Day to Father's Day. And so the name Chelsea Chop comes from the Chelsea Flower Show in England, and it occurs around the same time that we suggest you apply this method. I also like to call it mimicked herbivory because I like to imagine, and yes, it's a bit of anthropomorphizing, but I like to imagine the plants are getting eaten and then they're going, oh gosh, we're getting eaten. We need to make more blooms and more seed instead of growing really tall. So anyway, this can be a really great strategy in your garden if you plant something and then decide, oh wow, it's a bit tall for my liking. Consider giving it a little chop back. Some of our plants like aromatic aster, which I did not put in this garden, but we have elsewhere in the landscape. I often will cut it back multiple times within that time period of end of May, mid to mid June, and it still is lovely and bushy, and it's like I didn't even cut it back. So so some plants can handle it more than others. If you're going to apply this method in your own garden and you haven't done it before, consider you don't have to chop them all down. You could try just a section of that plant and see how it fares. Oh, also, pro tip, if you do that and we're in a drought, give your plants some water. It really stresses them out otherwise. So you can see the stress of that I inflicted on that plant on the right, but you can see it bouncing back with some new growth on the left. So we did use that method for this plant and blue sage, both of which are pretty tall and large, have a large presence in this garden the first couple years. But then after that, we started to remove them. So this is what the garden looks like this year. And I love this garden so much. It's everything I love about a garden. It's very whimsical, right? It's like a calendar prairie kind of, but on a very small scale. And for me, I really wanted to inspire people to try this at home, right? But can we talk for a second about summertime gardening woes? Ugh. This time of year, it's super hot in the Midwest. It's muggy. We're getting so much rain, and it is so hard to keep up with the garden sometimes. So I took this photo about a month ago, and you can see maybe in the distance or even towards the front of it that there's lots of crabgrass and foxtail and orchard grass coming up. So those are some warm season annuals, as well as I pulled like 5 passion vines out of there. So even though that soil was scraped, there was still plenty of seed in the bank, evidently. But something I like to suggest to folks is one, stay very hydrated this time of year if you are venturing out into your garden. But even like 10 minutes in the morning in your own garden can make a huge difference. It makes me feel good too to get out there, see what's going on in the garden, interact with it. Gardens are active, it's an activity, and so you have to actively be engaged with that process. So there are ways that you can work in your garden in the summertime but not kill yourself. And having friends join you too can really help. But so with this being in the kind of the fourth year of this garden, I made some pretty big decisions, right? So we ended up digging out and rehoming about 200 rigid goldenrod plants. Right. So remember, I planted 500 plants in there initially of various species. Gone into year 4, there were 200 rigid goldenrod plants. So it pushed out some of the coneflower species. It made itself right at home. Again, it's a really great plant. It's just, it doesn't fit the goals of that particular garden for me, which includes biodiversity, lots of variation throughout the seasons, and having it semi-formal. It was just too big for its britches here. So thankfully, we found a lot of great homes for it during MDC's Go Native event, which is in April, where they give away native plants to our community to advocate for more native landscapes. So nothing went to waste, but I say all of this for you all to understand, hey, it's okay to remove a plant from your garden. Maybe you move it to a different area in your landscape. Maybe you give it to a friend, with the caveat like, hey, this is a big friend here. We want to make sure you're giving it lots of room for it to grow. But these are decisions you make, and it's okay to change your mind and shift because gardens are dynamic, just like you and me, right? So in its fourth year, more editing, more weeding, summer times, especially beginning of April, beginning of spring or mid-spring, those are going to be kind of the prime times for weeding the garden. So getting clear on what your goals are and what plants you want to have in that garden are going to be really important. And every year, it's going to be a little different. There are some years where I see a plant volunteer itself into that landscape, and I'm like, hey, I want to go ahead and leave that plant in there. Maybe I'm going to bring it into the fold. But oftentimes, just given how much biodiversity was already in that space, I wanted to make sure I wasn't making it chaotic, right? Because that can happen very easily, especially in a small space like this. So at this recent gardening session here on the edge of the glade, so it kind of goes east to west, like glade, prairie savanna, just given the shade and sunlight situations. But here in the glade area, which has lots of pea gravel and has rock pink, which you can't see it blooming because it was in the morning. It loves to open up its bright magenta flowers in the afternoon. But just after an hour of very delicately pulling out things like crabgrass and foxtail and some volunteer trees, it made a huge difference. So you can see that there on the right. So I mentioned with those two more prolific species, rigid goldenrod and blue sage, some of our coneflower species also got outcompeted. So we went ahead and earlier this spring added some more little baby echinacea plants throughout the garden here. So you can see the side oats grasses there among the pink flags, but we ended up adding some more of those coneflower species just to help give them a boost. So that is something to think about too. Like if you want to see more of a certain plant in your garden that was there initially, go ahead and add some more. I also like to think about adding seed or desirable seed that you want to see in your garden into the seed bank. So a practice I've been applying into the Discovery Center landscape over the past couple years is in wintertime, walking around like a little seed fairy and adding seed of existing plants into different garden beds. So this winter, I'll be adding in more blazing star seed and coneflower seeds. So this is a way to kind of strengthen that seed bank and have plants come up eventually that you do want to see in the garden, right? So that's just one way to help support those goals. So again, I want to show you kind of the before and the after of this garden here. On the left, it was a very woolly garden. And that's not to say things like crownbeard don't support tons of wildlife, because they do. They support a lot of generalist species and they make really cute frost flowers. But, you know, with it being a public garden, we wanted a more semi-formal area to come through and make sure that it felt really welcoming and accessible. And encourage people to plant natives at home. And some people loved it so much that they even got married in my garden, which brought me to tears. So shout out to my friend Kristen List, who got married recently in Primrose Prairie. It was such a sweet moment to hear about after the fact. So I couldn't help but share these photos. And it timed perfectly with the Eastern prickly pear's first bloom. So congratulations, Kristen, and your partner on your lovely marriage. So again, thinking about the main takeaways of a garden, planning, always observing, even before you plant, while you're planting, after you plant, that's going to really help you figure out what's going to work here, what doesn't work here, and also understanding that designs are roadmaps. I don't think it should be a hard and fast rule. Sure, it can really help you plan and plan out how many plants you'll need, where they're going to be in the garden in relationship to one another. But I really use it as a roadmap. So when I got my design finished and I went to install my plants, it shifted completely from that design. But it was just a way to help me kind of sort through my thoughts. So don't worry if you end up kind of deviating from your initial design. You'll know what works best over time. Prepping, it'll set you up for success, as well as with the installation process. Take it from me or don't take it from me. Consider fewer species and planting in phases. You can always expand and add more, especially if it's a brand new garden. Make it easy on yourself. Start to know these initial plants, get familiar with them, become intimate with them throughout the growing season, and then consider adding more based on your goals. And then, of course, maintenance. Gardens are dynamic. Plants and goals will change over time, right? And don't forget, there's no such thing as a no maintenance garden. These are cultivated spaces. And if you want to have your goals apparent in the garden, you're probably going to have to apply maintenance practices that support that. So I want to thank you all. My name is Cydney Ross, Outdoor Education Manager with Deep Roots. We have lots of programs that we offer as well here in the Kansas City Metro, including hands-on free workshops where you can garden with me at the Discovery Center, learn seasonal skills like what is this plant, what's blooming right now, how do I manage this? as well as our semi-monthly webinars, newly rebranded as Curious by Nature. Every first and third Thursdays, we cover landscapes across Kansas and Missouri, as well as our habitat garden tours and native plant sales that happen seasonally. You can find out information about all of these programs and events on our website, deeproots.org, or shoot me an email. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Sydney. That was so great, and people are thanking you and praising in the comments and the Q&A, so thank you.
Appreciate you all. Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Lily.
Yeah,
Oh,
we have some
Arden.
questions.
Yes, and I just saw actually someone made a really great comment. Can you describe what it looks like in the
Yeah,
winter? I totally forgot to mention that. So and if I can real quick, Lily, before we jump
yeah,
into the Q&A, I
yeah.
just want to say that I visited the Discovery Center for the first time ever in winter of like 2018, and I fell in love with the place. So in the winter time in this garden, there are standing cone heads. There are lots of grasses like eyelash grass and side oats grama. Some of them at a certain point will lose their seeds, but they still have that nice fine texture. Lots of variation and color too, from light tans to deep rust. So I leave my gardens up through the winter time, and then we do a cutback for these gardens, especially Primrose Prairie, at about early spring once temperatures are warm enough for our little insects friends to emerge. So thank you for mentioning that in the chat, and I'm super excited to now jump into our Q&A.
Yeah, totally. We had some questions about site preparation.
Sure.
Elisa, Nancy, and Lori, they had some specific questions about herbicides that I can provide resources on in the follow-up email, but
Sure.
really it was, or one of the sentiments was, if I have a lawn of, say, crabgrass, can you speak to that glyphosate and then the turning of the sod method a little bit more?
Yes. So, okay. So with glyphosate, I always recommend, uh, and this is a quote from my buddy Andy Carmack at MDC, the label is the law. So always refer to the label and take proper precautions wearing your PPE, right? Long sleeves, closed-toed shoes, gloves, goggles, things like that. I will refer to you, Lily, to and maybe I'll send you a link to that Benjamin Vaught article I read recently, where he mentions like applying a light spray of diluted glyphosate to the lawn. So you actually in that particular method, you don't turn the sod over, though I have done that in my own front yard, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. But with that particular process I was mentioning, it sounds like he kills the grass off with herbicide. And once it's dead, he's actually digging right into the sod and planting into it. So, and then from there, doing a light, like 1 to 2 inches, I think, of mulch just to help, again, prevent any excess plants from growing up that you didn't intend to have in that garden. And so that seems like kind of the gist of that particular process. Now, I've done it all types of ways. In the house I live in currently, I moved in last year, and before I even moved in, I killed my lawn. I have no chill. I removed my lawn, and I actually did it by cutting out chunks of sod and flipping it over, so that the roots were exposed, but the turf was there. And I was able to use that to like smother other areas of grass as I went along. It's super labor intensive, but boy, it felt really good to let out some steam and try that method. And now I know there's pros and cons to all that. You're definitely like disturbing your soil and disrupting the microbial layer and all of that. But there's so many ways to do it, and it just depends on what your abilities and goals are for that particular garden. But yeah, great question.
Great, thank you. There was a specific point about pre-emergent herbicides and another specific point on the whole thing with Roundup like glyphosate no longer being the principal component in Roundup. Do you have any comments on that?
I sure do. Okay, so I want to speak to the glyphosate aspect with in regards to Roundup first, and then come back to the pre-emergent. So I actually became informed about how the brand Roundup no longer has glyphosate in it as an active ingredient in your like local box stores, like I'm thinking Home Depot, Lowe's, even small nurseries. But there are other brands like I think it's like Kills All with a Z. It has glyphosate in it. A lot of brush killers will have glyphosate in it. But I became familiar with that aspect because of y'all at Missouri Prairie Foundation and the Missouri Invasive Plant Council, because my friend and friend of Deep Roots and MPF, Angela Sokolowski, who is the invasive species coordinator for MDC, wrote a fabulous article about it. And I was like, wait, what? And then I went to my own bottle of Roundup that I bought like a year or two ago. And sure enough, it didn't have glyphosate in it. And it's very problematic because I know glyphosate can definitely cause cancer, right? It can like make you sick. It's an herbicide, right? So you have to be really careful with how you apply it and apply it judiciously. Don't go overboard, protect yourself, all of that. But the ingredients that they've replaced your typical Roundup with stay in your soil longer, have more harmful effects. So definitely read the label before you go and buy a bottle of herbicide. But you can also go to your tractor and farm supply stores and seek other types of herbicides that will have glyphosate in it. So again, label is the law. Make sure you're reading through everything very thoroughly and carefully before you make your purchase, but especially before you apply it to your own landscape. So those are my thoughts on that. And then in regards to herbicide with pre-emergent, I've actually never used it before, but I was just thinking like 2 months ago, gosh, maybe that's something I should consider for some of my gardens, because if you're dealing with lots of plant growth and you don't have as much time to be out in your garden for 30 minutes or however long every day to maintain it, that could be a really useful tool. But my only thought is, are there, and this is something I'm not sure, I'm gonna have to do research on, are there pre-emergents that only impact certain species? Because if they are more of a generalist, right, and they impact all seeds, then it could defeat the purpose for me of wanting to leave seed heads up, not only for wildlife support, but to reseed themselves into the landscape. So that's something I'm going to have to do a little more research on my end. If you all have feedback or of your own experiences, share with us in the chat. Would love to hear from you. But it is something to consider. And there's so many tools out there. There's so many ways to do things. And as long as you're cautious and, making sure you are approaching it from an educated standpoint, I say right on. Yeah.
But thank you. We had questions about species compositions in Primrose Prairie. One, could you reiterate how many species you ended up planting in initially? You said 500 plugs, but again, could you remind us the number of species? And
Yeah.
maybe while you're talking about that, could you discuss, what were your big and talls? What were your little ones? You
Yeah.
had, goldenrods are really, it was, what do you think about, or, maybe what goldenrod would you recommend? Maybe thoughts
Yeah.
there.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So, yeah. So, species composition in terms of visual appeal is really important when it comes to the planting stages. So, like a lot of landscape design books you'll read, the general recommendations, like first you start with your structure, right? So that could be woody species, that could be stones or rocks, boulders, it could be sculptures, right? Thinking about what is that year-round thing that's going to be present in your landscape. So, given that this garden was really long, really narrow, but could be viewed from at least 3 out of 4 sides, from up close to far away, I wanted to make sure I had all my taller things, both plants and structural pieces, in the center of that bed. So from east to west, right down the middle, with the exception of that far east end, which is where the pea gravel and the more diminutive like rock pinks, and leading into the edge of the primroses there. So uh, I did mention that we planted over 500 plugs into this garden, but we ended up with about 28 species and counting because you go to a plant sale and you see some cool plants and you're like, gosh, I gotta have that plant. I'm gonna add that to that garden, to that repertoire. So I would say approximately 28 species, and there's still 28 species at least in that garden. And so with that in mind, again, thinking about taller species in the middle and then having lower plants along the edge, specifically along that walking path. I wanted to make sure when you viewed it head on, like if you're on the south side facing north, I wanted you to see the whole spectrum of the plants there. So that's why I did a nice meandering strip of Missouri evening primrose, like the image you see behind me. One thing I forgot to mention is of those 500 plants, like 90 of them were Missouri evening primrose, which in retrospect is a bit overkill because it is a pretty gregarious plant, but hey, it looks great. So I guess it works pretty well. And then I had also mentioned, the sociability of plants and pairing similar sociabilities near each other. So further to the west along the edge, I have a nice little patch of pussy toes, which are doing really well there because that end on the west end gets a little bit more shade from the hackberry in the afternoon. So things don't get as large at that end, giving some space to the pussy toes. And I actually have both species in there, both Antonaria neglecta, which is prairie, and Antonaria parlinii, which is parlins or that broadleaf pussy toes. And so keeping those kind of in their own spaces and then keeping the rest of the plants in their own lanes, really. So sometimes I would even edit out, if primrose would start to encroach on the rock pink, I would edit some of those out. It's not like I was at a deficit of primrose, so it didn't give me any heartburn to kind of cut back or pull away some of those plants as they move across that landscape. Other species, I mentioned having some grasses in there. I love incorporating grasses or sedges into a garden design. Not only is it great habitat for wildlife, even host plants for insects like fritillaries. Like I think some of those grasses host the fritillary, or not fritillaries, skippers rather. So it's nice to have that kind of variation for habitat and wildlife support, but also visuals, right? With our native forbs or flowers, it tends to be lots of like broad shapes of the flower heads or the foliage. And by incorporating some grasses or sedges, you get some nice fine texture and kind of a rest for your eyes. So throughout the entire garden, I planted both eyelash grass, which is specifically Bouteloua gracilis, and side oats grama, which is Bouteloua curtipendula. Probably not saying that right, but Latin's a dead language anyway. So having that matrix of grasses throughout not only leads your eye, but gives it moments to rest as well. Additionally, I have hairy petunia, Ruellia humilis, which is a beautiful little purple perennial petunia looking flower growing throughout and blooming right now. And then later in the season, the blazing stars. So I mentioned there's three types of blazing stars in that garden: Liatris, pycnostacia, which has just finished blooming, followed by Liatris scariosa. And once we get into late summer, early fall, Liatris aspera will start to bloom. So again, pulling that quality of that plant throughout the garden and kind of almost expanding the seasons of that plant. I mean, not actually, because you got three different species there, but visually it kind of draws it out through the growing season, which is very nice. And then you get to the fall blooms, which were supposed to be rigid goldenrod and blue sage. So I still have retained a lot of the blue sage in the garden, though I do typically cut it back like Chelsea chop style in end of May, beginning of June, just so that it still has a little bit of height, but it's not like 8 feet tall like it does in our cultivated landscapes. So I do that. And then we completely removed the rigid goldenrod, as I mentioned. So some other goldenrod species that could be really good in that garden. I think zigzag goldenrod, especially on that west side that gets a little more shade, could be quite nice. So I'm definitely thinking about, okay, what's the plan for next year? I'm gonna see how things fare that since we've incorporated more cone flowers into the bed and removed that rigid goldenrod. But I would love to get more seasonal blooms in there specifically for the fall. So I'm curious what kind of goldenrods do you like? I know there's besides zigzag goldenrod, showy goldenrod, though I'm not quite sure how prolific that plant can be, but oh, and actually, kind of funny thing, this background image that you see on the slide here, that's around the pond. We planted that, I think, in like right when I started working at the Discovery Center in 2020. And the person who designed it had selected like, I think, 6 different species of goldenrod. Now it's just a monoculture of rigid goldenrod. So that kind of speaks to how gregarious that particular plant is. So there's lots of other options out there, but learn from our experiences, go visit different nature centers like the Discovery Center, Shaw Nature Reserve, and see what these plants are doing in different landscapes and compare them to your own site because that can give you some really helpful clues. Yeah. Does that answer all the questions I think for that segment?
Yes, thank you. Great job handling multiple questions. And a
Yeah.
point to also address is one person asked, why no shrubs? Yeah, can you speak
Yeah.
to that?
It just wasn't I just didn't want any shrubs in this garden. We've got 9 acres. We've got lots of shrubs and trees throughout the Discovery Center, and I went with rocks instead. So yeah, but you could definitely incorporate some shrubs in your own garden. I will say there's like a stand of smooth sumac right like adjacent to this particular garden. So that actually, even though it's not technically in Primrose Prairie, it does give some fall color right next to that garden, which is really lovely. Such a beautiful plant.
Great, thank you. You mentioned that, yeah, compost is a part of this system too. Do you add compost on a yearly basis, or can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah,
Just the
great
once?
question. Yeah, no, I don't add any additional compost. That was just for the initial planting. Again, so you clearly do not need to scrape your soil. That was just the method that the Discovery Center used, right, for this particular garden. I think partly because they wanted to use that bobcat. But if you're preparing a new garden bed, whether you've solarized or, the Benjamin Bott method, as I'll call it, or lasagna composting or sheet mulching, just adding some compost can help get your plants ready to go. Gives them lots of nutrients. As you all may or may not be familiar with, native plants don't need fertilizing if they're in the ground, right? They're in an open system. They're getting nutrients from the soil through their roots. Mycorrhizas helping distribute some of that as well, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I don't top dress with any compost. We will occasionally do some light mulching, especially like when we had giant craters where we removed rigid goldenrod. Some of those plants were like had a diameter of about like 2.5 feet wide. And so that was just like a perfect opening for other plants to come in. And when we added like those tiny little baby cone flowers in earlier this year, did a light mulching around them just to help them out, help retain some of that moisture, help prevent competing plants from out competing them before they can get established. But yeah, great question. I do not add any additional compost to that garden since the initial planting.
Great, thank you. Um, we have a question about, um, let's see, deer in this
Ah.
garden.
Yeah. So deer, and it looks like Lily may have froze for a second, but we don't have deer. We don't have deer pressure in our gardens at the Discovery Center. We're located in the urban core, surrounded by concrete. But what we do have is rabbit pressure. And so and pressure from people. Um, so just to reiterate, in case I was frozen for anybody. We don't get deer pressure at the Discovery Center, but what we do get is rabbit pressure. We get the what I call squirrel zoomies in the fall where they rip stuff out, trying to like especially newly planted things to plant acorns and whatnot. And we also get pressure from children, from people walking through gardens and things like that. So we are very lucky in that way to not have pressures from deer. But there are some methods you can implement. I know like it's not beautiful, but you could fence things off until they get established. Putting cages around them. I know, actually, my friend Anna Grather had just showed me she bought these little cages, I think from like Epic Gardening website, and they look like a crawdad trap, but it's just this little woven metal basket you put on top of your plants. I know it's not beautiful, I know it's not ideal, but we are also planting for wildlife, and that includes deer, includes rabbits, includes squirrels, definitely includes people, right? And so there are some things you can do to help your plants while they're getting established. Oftentimes, I'll see here in Kansas City, rabbits, again, being kind of the dominant pressure here in our area. Like there's one garden I designed and they had installed like 20 feet wide swath of woodland phlox auricata, which I swear is like the rabbit's favorite thing to eat. They mowed those puppies down. But then a couple weeks later, because those plants were established, I think they've been established like at least one growing season, maybe two, they bloomed again, right? So it's kind of like the Chelsea chop. It's mimicked herbivory. Well, that's literally herbivory. But these plants have adapted to be eaten. And so, of course, it can be really frustrating and disheartening if you plant a brand new garden, you put all this time, sweat, tears, money, resources into it, and it just immediately gets eaten. So do take care to protect your new baby plants, whether they're herbaceous plants like flowers or grasses or sedges, and especially our woody species like shrubs and trees. So, but once they get established after a few years, they should be able to handle a little munch or two.
Great, thank you. And that's also important to note you mentioned, pressure from people or our footsteps. And I loved that you brought up how stones in a planting can be great because that's a safe spot to walk on. So thank you. Um,
Absolutely,
we
yeah.
had, yeah, and I love the rock work in this planting too. It's also really awesome.
Thank you.
Um, One question about the seed bank, or you mentioned how you like to implement, or are you collecting those seeds on site and you're just sort of moving them to different areas? Is that what you're doing?
So we're doing a combination. We're very fortunate at the Discovery Center to have a greenhouse where myself and with support of the current landscape crew, we grow and volunteers, we grow a lot of native plants that we give away to the public. So they have a pretty decent amount of seed in their seed fridge currently. So I'll use seed from there, but I will also collect seed from elsewhere in the landscape. But something that, especially with echinacea species, it's important to have some good genetic diversity. So I try to get seed from all types of places because a lot of times I notice that coneflowers are susceptible to Astor's yellow, which is a virus that spreads from leafhoppers. And unfortunately, if you have one of those plants that has Astor's yellow, it will likely spread to your other plants, and then you have to rip them out and throw them away. You can't even compost them because that virus can spread and destroy these other plants. So that's partly why I don't just rely on specifically the coneflower seed from the Discovery Center, though I do like to harvest a little bit throughout. But primarily, at the Discovery Center, we really like to leave the vegetation intact through the winter so that birds and mammals can eat the seed, and so our insects can overwinter in the stems and within the foliage. So, yeah, so great question. Lots of variation. I know like Missouri Wildflower Nursery has great seed selections. Pure Air Natives is another place. And yeah, and there's other places further north like Prairie Moon Nursery and things like that. But I try to stick with seeds and plants from our ecoregion, just given that they've adapted to our climate, to pathogens found here, and to our wildlife. So I try to stick with that as a rule of thumb, but seeds are hard to come by. There's not a lot of good seed stock out there available to the public, unfortunately, especially here in the Midwest.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll be following up in the email with resources, particularly our resource guide that you can use to find seed sources and native plant retailers near you. I'll also follow up with um, just further information addressing some of the questions that may remain in the chat still. But I'll leave with kind of one final question of your if you have any Kansas City or, regional guide for the whens and hows of seed collection, or if you have any specific guides on seed collection, ethics of seed collection, where you can, where you can't. And I'll also make that clear in the follow-up, but if you could just speak on that.
Sure. So I don't personally, because again, it's tricky because every location is different, especially like if you're comparing like MDC conservation areas, which they do not allow you to collect seed, right? That seed needs to stay on site so that those areas, especially the old growth areas, I'm thinking like some of the prairies and coal camp, that MPF does an amazing job supporting. You got to leave that seed there because it is much more needed in those places than our own personal gardens, right? But we do have a wonderful local organization called Casey Wildlands, and you can learn a lot from them. They do in-person seed collecting, which then those seeds go to other old growth and areas of conservation concern. And they work with MDC, they work with Johnson County Parks and Recreation District, and so they're able to spread that seed across state line, which helps with that genetic diversity. So I would refer you to them for in-person opportunities there. In terms of like guides, I don't really have any references to like resources, but one thing I will say is you could always, well, of course, you got to look at the rules for each location, maybe make some friends with some folks who own large private land that need help collecting seed. Maybe you could ask them to have some of that seed too. But I also like to just in general, when it comes to foraging, whether it's seed, whether it's like mushrooms, or if I'm harvesting materials to make ink for my paintings. I follow Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's advice on the honorable harvest. So which is such a great resource. And if you haven't read her books, Gathering Moss is like I think one of the first novels or books she wrote. And she's got a new one out about service berries. But in Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about the honorable harvest and you're only taking about a third of what you find or less, leaving the rest for wildlife, and making sure you're not taking it all from one area. And I'm paraphrasing and just that's just a snippet of the honorable harvest, but that's just really good, I think, in general way to think about our interaction in our natural systems and landscapes. Oftentimes, our wildlife needs these things a lot more than we do. So just keep that in mind and buy from our local nurseries when you can, because we need to support our local native plant industry. We need to see more nurseries. We need to see more seed sources. So there's lots of ways you can do that simply by supporting those organizations that already do it best. So yeah.
Thank you, Cydney. Thank you so much. That was really great, and I appreciate your time and for you sharing with us today.
Of course, my absolute pleasure. And I just appreciate everyone tuning in to learn about lessons learned at Primrose Prairie, which featured glade, savanna, and prairie species. And I hope it's helpful for your own gardening adventures.
Lovely. Ah, amazing. I will put a link in the chat right now to access our, other webinars. This will be up on the YouTube channel by the end of the week, so you can watch it again um, and share it with friends. This was very useful. And I'm going to share a little bit about upcoming events, but thank you again, Cydney.
You're so welcome. And if folks, if beyond the resources, you're also welcome to reach out to me. I'm always happy to have a conversation about native plants. So thank you so much, Lily. Thank you,
Of
NPS
course.
Native.
Yeah. Amazing. And I'll include Sydney's, contact, how to reach her, a bunch, a rich email with lots of resources in it is coming to you. So yeah, thank you. Um, before we conclude this webinar, I want to share about, our upcoming in-person and online events. So 4 p.m. August 13th is our next webinar, Dispelling Myths of Native Gardening. It's a panel with Sajo Abdallah, Eric Eaton, Nina Fogel, and Scott Woodbury. We're excited to provide this live panel discussion to tackle your nagging questions and assumptions around native plant gardening. We hope you can tune in and add to the discussion. The next plan is to register for a virtual hike for MPF's or at MPF's Pennsylvania Prairie. That's with Emily Gustafson and Bruce Schutte. That webinar will air at 4 p.m. on August 27th. We have in-person events coming up. We on August 1st, this Friday from 4 to 5:30, there's a free native pasture tour highlighting productive prairie forage in Clinton, Missouri. Steve Klubine is opening up his farm for a Missouri Prairie Foundation tour to help others see firsthand the benefits of establishing and maintaining a native forage grazing system. This walking tour, it's limited to 25 people, so registration is required. And you can find that on our website. The MPF annual dinner is August 16th in Columbia with guest speaker Dr. Jesse Nippert, presentation of awards, and there will be a silent auction. Tickets are available at moprairie.org, but remember that registration ends August 7th. And finally, join us for an introduction fern identification and ecology workshop in Jefferson City on August 22nd. This is a 4 focusing on fern identification, ecology, and appreciation, but will also cover their curious reproduction strategies, specialized terminology, and geographical patterns. And this workshop will cover the same content as the fern workshop that we offered in May. So for the latest event, bi-weekly newsletter to on social media channels. So thank you again, Cydney, and everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you for being here.